Great to see you here. This is a new presentation for lesson 8, and we have, again, like in the previous ones, two parts. This will be part 1. In lesson 8 we are looking at where we come from the idea to the project charter. And what are we going to discuss in this lesson? In this lesson we look at the identification and analysis of stakeholders, parameters for project evaluation, what words we can and we should not use in the charter. Very important is the definition of project success. When is our project a success? We have the 3-step project definition process. I will look at a model of a charter that has been developed by the Custer Academy so that it can be used by people and students when they have to make a charter. We'll look at the Lexus case study, and of course we have again a discussion forum and end of lesson multiple choice quiz. Now, when we are looking at the learning outcomes, we look at the identification of stakeholders and which key stakeholders to include in the charter, evaluate the project performance based on the selection criteria, distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable words to use in the charter, determine the meaning of project success, describe the project definition process to create the project charter, create a charter, apply the template to create a charter according to PMI standards, and we will evaluate different cases. Now let's have a look at selecting the project. When we select a project, we have different ways or different origins. We can look at the new product development, for example, the Lexus case, or a new website or something new. We can look at employee recommendations. We can see that employees may have very good ideas, and some of those ideas may lead to a project. We also look at the changes in the law, for example, environmental protection, the GDPR rules for European Union related to data protection and things like that. So basically there are a lot of reasons why you can have, let's say, a project. Where do these projects come from? And of course we're going to see here how we deal with that in the charter. We look also at financial selection because we have different parameters that we are considering. We'll look at financial parameters, and we've been discussing that before. We'll look at the payback time, the return on investment, the present value, future value, net present value, the internal rate of return, economic value add, and other parameters. And we also defined what we called the return on investment policy, where we look at a combination of these parameters to evaluate a project. Other elements are very important. Risk factors. What's the risk factor of the project? Is it a risk we can accept or not? We may say that the risk is too high for the project. Normally we should already know this from the business case, also the financial parameters. And of course we have time factors which relate to the progress and the completion of the project. The financial parameters, we looked at those at the beginning of the course, but of course the payback time, we can set a maximum payback time. Payback time is not so interesting, but it's a very easy parameter to evaluate. But we have to take into account that time value of the money is not considered here. We have the return on investment, so how well is our investment? The same problem here, no time value of the money is considered here. We have present and future value. Present value, we can calculate the future cash flows. What is their present value? What is the future value of a cash flow or a series of cash flows? And they lead to two important parameters. First of all, the net present value, or the NPV. We know that the NPV has to be positive because it means that we discounted all the future cash flows to their present value and we subtract the initial investment, and that amount has to be positive. A project with a negative net present value should not be accepted. Another parameter related to time value of money and net present value is the internal rate of return. The internal rate of return is in fact the yield of your investment, and we can find it when the net present value is equal to 0. So we're trying to find that yield, that percentage, and we have to compare that with the WACC or the required rate of return. The required rate of return is the cost of capital plus a percentage to take into account the risk factor of the project. When we look at the charter, what are we or what should we include in the charter? First of all, the name and the description of the project. That's the first thing. We have the name of the project, we can give it a name. Naming of a project is also something you have to be careful about, because when you have these things there, the element is very simple. You have to give a name that is not easily identified. For example, during the Second World War, there was the project, the Manhattan Project. Nobody knew, it's nothing related about the creation of a nuclear weapon. There is also the tank, which was a project during the First World War, where they were in fact developing armored vehicles, the tanks that we know today, and basically the people related it to tank because tank was typically identified as a water tank. The enemy would not be interested in the design of a water tank. Very clear definition of the needs. We will talk about the needs later. It's very important. What do you want to realize? We also have to describe what, why, and who. What is the project about? Why are we doing it? And who is involved in the project? For whom are we doing this? We can also add time and budget information, by when and how much. The timing information is also can be very important. The budget also important. We have to see in the charter that there is already a certain amount reserved to do the project. We also look at the business case or the statement of work that we have. The business case is, or the statement of work, both of them can be the basis for the charter, and we can find a lot of information in both of them. We also talk about the name of the clients or client, the sponsor, and the project manager. So we already define the project manager once we start with the project charter. We also have reference documents that can be important, like regulations, norms, and standards. When we look at the return on investment policy, remember that I already spoke about this. Here we're looking at a combination of financial parameters. We can say that the payback time has to be smaller than or equal to 36 months. The net present value has to be larger than 0. The internal rate of return has to be larger or equal to the WACC plus a risk factor. Now be careful when we're looking at a program and we're looking at a combination of projects that are necessary for the program. We have to look at these parameters related to the program, and we may have some projects that do not really comply with these elements, but they're essential for the program. And in that case, we have to include them. So when we look at the program, we look at those parameters: payback time, net present value, internal rate of return, and some other parameters. We want to optimize the program. We don't want to optimize the, let's say, the individual projects. When we look at information, we may get information, and when we're starting with a project, the information is typically obtained from the business case or the statement of work. Now, we may have old projects that suddenly bubble up again and they become relevant, but we have to see, is this still relevant? Is the information still applicable? Is it still useful? Are the financial parameters that we identified in the old project, are they still valid today? Another thing is that happens, and I had it once or twice in my military career. We still have some money left. Let's do some project. Let's do Project Titanic. Now, we all know what happened with Titanic, but the example I have was a project in some building, military building, where one concrete beam was relaxing. There was a problem. It was pre-strained concrete, very new at the time, and something went wrong, but nobody really knew what was happening. So when I looked at the project, we removed the beam, replaced it by another one. But during the evaluation, I found out that the beam was in fact too long and it was sticking out of the building, which was basically the reason of the instability. Later of that year, you know, in state, you have a budget year, you have to finish all the budget at the end. My commanding officer said, okay, there are 20 of those beams in the building. I have so much money, it's enough to do that project, and we just replace all the beams. And I said, no, I don't agree, because the thing is very simple. That one beam was having a problem. I verified all the other ones, they're all okay. If they're already for 20 years and nothing happened, probably nothing will happen. And they looked very fine when I did my evaluation. Of course, my boss was not very happy, because he already promised to the general that he would have projects for that money. And of course he puts the blame on me, so I had to find other projects. We found some other interesting projects, but I just didn't want to invest the money in a project that was basically useless. Now, sometimes we have missing input, we have to get it, we need some input to start with the project. Many of my customers, they don't give or didn't give all the input necessary. The problem here was very simple. You just challenge them, you put there some information and you ask for their approval. And basically you make some assumptions about the missing input. And then they are obliged to react because they have to sign the document saying, hey, this is good. Now, this is not necessarily good. So when you ask for the input, you don't give anything, be proactive, give them what you think it should be, and I'm sure they will react very quickly because now they are blocking the project and you need that missing input. The value of the input, it's sometimes very tricky, certainly when we have like IT projects and projects that are more would be more interesting to do with an agile method. When you don't have a stability of the input, we have to see that we find ways to work around. So how valuable is the input? Is it relevant or not? Where does the input come from? Not everybody can give the input. Is it relevant? So all these things you have to evaluate when you get those old or that information about a project. Another very important question is about the customer. Does the customer know what they want? Is there a clear vision? If you don't have a clear vision, it becomes very difficult to define a project in a waterfall environment, and you may have to go to a different type of environment. You may have to go to agile. It's always very difficult when you have a customer who doesn't know what they really want. Now, the golden rule for everything related to project management everywhere in the area of project management is to be proactive. If you don't know it, you ask for it. If there is a problem, you bring the problem to the table. You don't hide it. You have to be proactive and challenge the people to give you what you need. Another element which is sometimes, let's say, quite a problem or can be quite a problem is in fact the languages. When we look at international projects, we may be dealing with different languages. Now, many companies are using English as a main language. Nevertheless, when you talk to French people, Italians, also Germans, there are Czech people, there are a lot of countries where the level of English is not really well enough, and you may have, let's say, confusion about certain words. Non-native speakers may have a different understanding. Even when you look at English, only English, there are different types of English, different types of Spanish, and the words are used in a different way. Now, I remember my boss being promoted to a different office from Belgium to Holland. He was Flemish, from same town like me, from Antwerp, and he was talking to the Dutch. Now, Dutch and Flemish are basically the same languages. We call it North and South Dutch. The language and all the words are basically similar. The grammar is similar. The writing is similar. But some words may have a different meaning. So when I said something during a meeting where he said, I accept your proposal, the same thing, he used the Flemish words and it was interpreted in a different way. It was interpreted that it didn't agree, and it was a lot of protest, and he didn't understand. He said, yeah, but I just agreed to it. And then everybody started laughing because they understood that he was using the Flemish expression to tell to the Dutch. After that, people were having a lot of fun with these different words, and people understood each other a lot better. Also, we have PMI definitions, which is already a good start to reduce confusion. There are definitions, but you also can make a project dictionary. So when you're using abbreviations, for example, it may be very useful. When you're using specific words to explain what they mean, even have the translation so that all people are on the same level. These things are very important. Also, abbreviations. In the military, there is a strict rule about abbreviations, but in many companies, I saw that people could enter a new abbreviation in the database, and you could find the same abbreviation meaning other things. I had one discussion with one of my colleagues, and she said, well, this is, I don't really understand, let's say, the element here, because she used or saw the abbreviation FTE, which is typically used as a full-time equivalent. But in the sentence when I read it, it was not about people, about full-time equivalents. It was about terminating equipments of data lines, and it was the field terminating equipment, which is basically the modem where your data line enters the building. A lot of things like that may lead to confusions, and you have to be aware of those. If you really have a good PMO, you can make a dictionary, you can make a list of approved abbreviations. Very important to avoid confusion, and of course, whenever you have a doubt, be proactive, ask about it. Something may be completely different. There are some words to avoid in, let's say, in a charter. We have to choose the right words, and when a word can be confusing, it may lead to misunderstandings, and it can cost a lot of money. There was one project in the United States where they said a prototype has to be tested in water. Now, there are different types of water. You have sweet water, you have water of the Dead Sea, which is extremely salty, you have water of a specific ocean, Red Sea water is more saline than others, so you have different possibilities, and they just looked at testing the prototype in water. They were in the center of the United States, I think Utah, and the people who made the description expected the prototype to be tested in seawater, in the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, which is of course a big difference because you have to travel there and it has extra expenses. Now, you have to be careful also when people are using certain words. A word that's for me always confusing is ASAP, and immediately, as soon as possible. Now, people typically use ASAP as a more polite version of immediately. Immediately sounds very controlling, very demanding. Nevertheless, for me, there is a difference. As soon as possible means that you have to do something which is a priority, but you have other priorities to complete. It's in the priority list, but it's not put on the top. When you look at immediately, you have to do it on that moment. There may be a reason for that. I used to have a friend, and we were talking about a project. She needed something, and I asked, when do you need it? And she said, ASAP. Okay, that's good, but when you need it? Yeah, ASAP. Okay, it's next week, okay. No, ASAP. I say, I have to discuss with the people what is possible. So what is the exact date that you need it? So finally I said, I will see if I can do it in 3 days. Not being happy, because for her, ASAP was immediately. Now I contacted somebody who was doing a lot of work, worked all midnight to finish this, and we brought to work. Of course it was too late, and then you can guess when the information, the work that has been done, when it was used. We had to finish it in 3 days. It should have been, when they asked today, it should have been finished the day before yesterday. And I was so shocked that the work that the person did, spent a lot of time on for free, was never used. So when I look at ASAP and immediately, my boss contacted me to do something ASAP. And 1 week later he asked me, well, what's the status? I said, well, it's in my priority list, but I didn't have time to start with it. I only worked for 8 hours a day. Of course, I was in a more serious position. I had more experience. And I saw on my boss's face that he meant immediately. So I asked him, I say, Tom, I don't remember the name, it was a nice guy, and I said, but I have the impression when I look at your face that you meant immediately. And he said, yeah, basically that. I say, well, there is a little problem because I have other important projects that are planned. Can I change their dates? Oh no, he said, it has to stay the same. I said, that's not possible. I cannot pack 24 hours of work in an 8-hour working day. And then he said, okay, make it ASAP. Now, when I discussed with him more, I asked him, and it's always a very good question, but it can be dangerous if you have a bad boss. I said, how long do you have that project, that information, that work that has to be completed? How long do you have it in your possession? And he said to me, 3 weeks. I said, okay, that's very nice. You leave it laying on your office for 3 weeks, and then you come to me that I have to finish it immediately. I don't think that's really acceptable. And he said, yeah, okay, you're right. So, but sometimes you have to be careful. But I asked him as soon as possible. The moment I had the possibility to talk with him, I could ask what is about, what is the problem. Now, putting there ASAP or immediately is better saying we need it by this time. Or when there is a reason to have it immediately, you just stop with the work we're doing because it's very important. And of course, your boss then takes the responsibility, or the, let's say it takes all the accountability on him or her. So basically that's the thing, you have to be careful, because if you do something and you change deadlines without contacting the other people, you have to see what you are doing. So I avoid ASAP and immediately in a charter. I don't put it there. Put a date, it's very clear, you can discuss about the dates. When we look at abbreviations, I said before, EV, earned value, expected value, planned value, present value. There are other abbreviations, AC, DC, actual cost, alternative current, direct current. Of course, you can estimate according to the content what the abbreviation probably would be, but it's can be very confusing. You have to explain what you are in fact meaning. Ambiguous words are very, let's say, difficult to avoid in some cases, but we have to avoid them. We typically talk about larger, faster, bigger, higher, things like that. But what does it mean? We have to make a car which is larger than another car. It has to be faster than another car. It has to be bigger, higher. These are things you're not going to use. You say, for example, faster. You want to have a car faster than the competing cars. So you say, my car has to have at least a maximum speed of, let's say, 245 kilometers per hour. I can imagine that in some places that you are living, that driving at 245 kilometers per hour would not really be possible. But in Germany, they can even go faster. When we look at the words, we have to use SMART word, and SMART means specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So you have to identify the words we are using. Are those words really SMART? Are they ambiguous? Yes, no. If they are ambiguous, you have to find another way to look at it. So very important what words you are using, because they will have an impact on the project that you're dealing with. When you look at defining the words to avoid confusion, you can make that list. We have a list already in the PMBOK. We can look at difficult specific terms used in different domains so that people understand what people are talking about. You have to understand what the project is about. You have to understand that terminology. And it's one of the elements you can start once you start with a project. You define those and you add more definitions. And when you have some confusions, you can bring the people together and let's say, okay, we have to make a decision. How will we resolve this? And things like that. When you write a charter, you can also have a list there what the terms mean, or the first time you use an abbreviation, which is the habit in a text, the first time you write it out completely, and then you add the abbreviation. The best way to avoid problems is in fact to never say abbreviation. So I will not say EV, I would say expected value. That's one way to avoid confusion. And of course, communication is very important, and one of the most important reasons for project failure is bad communication, confusions, all these things together. When we look at the charter, we also have to look at technical terminology. Now, it's a high-level document. It's made for higher management, and not everybody in the organization will understand the technology you're talking about. It can happen that your general manager or the people you're dealing with know this terminology, but it may also be shown to people who don't know it. Now, you have to see what happens in smaller companies. It's probably more likely that the people know about the technical words, the technical terminology. But in larger organizations, management is not about the technology; it's managing about other things. It's managing about the company, and in order to avoid any problems, the project charter or the goal of the project should not contain technical terms when you're describing the project. Another thing related with the charter is stakeholder identification. And here you see a mind map. In the center, stakeholder identification. We look at different categories: beneficiaries, influencers, government, providers, governance, users, and you can start with creating a mind map which is general for all your projects. You can expand it, and then when you have a specific project, you can say, okay, I can take out different people, different elements, and you create from the general mind map a mind map which is specific for your project. It's easy to make. There is easy software, even free software, to do this. We also look at the Salience model for stakeholder classification, because we also have to think about how important are those stakeholders. So we spoke about the Salience model before. We look at urgency, power, and legitimacy. And power is the ability to influence the outcome of the deliverables. Urgency is the time expected for responses, and the legitimacy is the authority, the level of involvement the stakeholder has on a project. So we have to look at those, and we can classify them in different elements. We look at critical at the core. It's the critical. These people have all the elements, and you have to focus on those. We have the dominant, power and legitimacy. We have the dangerous, power and urgency, and you have to engage those people, keep them satisfied. The dependent, there is no power, but they could support the others or they could support you. latent, only people who get involved when something serious happens. So we have to keep them involved, but we have to be sure that they don't go to one of those other categories and fight against us. Demanding people, people who think they need immediate attention, they may not be so powerful, but those people just have the idea that they have to have the information. Discretionary, those are the people you have to keep happy, you have to keep them in the loop. And non-stakeholders, so that maybe for the future they can be stakeholders later in the project. We can also classify them using the power interest grid. We have on the horizontal axis the interest and on the vertical axis the power, and we see people with high interest and high power. Those are the promoters. We have to manage them closely. We have the defenders with high interest and low power. We have to keep them informed. We have to monitor the apathetics, low interest and low power. And we have the people with low interest but with high power. These are the latents. You have to keep them satisfied, because if their interest increases, they may go to another category. There is also the Stakeholder Cube. So we have in fact three elements. We have attitude, power and interest, and you see the element here. You see where I found it on the website, so you can find it there too, and you see what different categories. You have more categories here that you can evaluate, and you use those three parameters to have a 3D evaluation of the people. And we look at the drawing. You have to find out where your different stakeholders are positioned. Another thing to look at is looking at the engagement levels. So we have to see, we have different categories: unaware, resistant, neutral, supported and leading. We have to see on the one side we have the stakeholders, we have their actual position and where we want them the desired position. So basically this helps us what the stakeholders want, where they are, and how we have to influence the way they think about the project. So that was the first part of lesson 8. In the next video we will discuss the second part. Looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you and bye bye.